Gans.
Wow,
hello, everyone. Welcome to All That Chat podcast. Thank you. Thank you. We're here with David Gans today. And David, we were just chatting before we started recording. So I have to just tell you now that we're live and on the air that I'm so grateful to you for doing this. And, you know, I was thinking, how would I introduce you? There's so many words that someone could use. I'm going to turn it around to you and say, how would you introduce yourself? How would you describe yourself? What would you go with?
I am a musician and an oral historian with a particular specialty in the music of the Grateful Dead. And I have done music-related journalism and oral history and publications and photography and stuff for my entire adult life. But everything started when I became a musician. I played the clarinet when I was a little kid, and then I switched to guitar and started writing songs when I was 15. And I was interested in nothing else from that time on. And I found work that furthered those interests. I became a journalist and wrote for mainstream music magazines for about 10 years before kind of specializing in the Grateful Dead and wandering into the radio business and stuff. But really, what I am is a musician who became a music journalist to enrich himself.
Do any of those early songs exist? Do any of those early songs exist?
Oh yeah, I play some of them still. I have songs in my current repertoire that date back to the early 1970s, and I wrote songs with a high school classmate named Stephen Donnelly, and several of the songs we wrote together back in those days are still in my active book. Yes,
love it, love it.
That's amazing. Now, see, I asked you that question because I think the way that we think of ourselves, that identity piece is super important. And so that tells me, and I'd love to know if this is true, that all of these other things that you have done and all the body of work you have, if approaching that from the lens of a musician at heart, I think that's what gives so much authenticity to everything you do. Would you agree with that?
I think that's true, yes. And I came into my journalism as a musician rather than as a fan / critic. You know, I was looking for practical information from these people. And when I started covering the Grateful Dead in the 1970s for a local magazine here called BAM, I connected with the musicians because I asked them questions that were reasonably well informed and practical and had to do with the fact that I was a musician who spoke their musical language. And I think that's one of the reasons why I was able to enter that world with some success, because the musicians recognized that I understood what they were doing more than a lot of journalists do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes a difference. And I appreciate that. So we were talking a little bit before about some of the magazines you had worked for, and I had asked you about Record, which was Ian Wenner. So that was post the founding of Rolling Stone magazine by a bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I became a journalist. I'm a California native, grew up in Southern California, and then moved to Northern California just in time for all the interesting stuff to happen in the mid 60s. Wound up in San Jose to graduate high school and fart around in college for a couple of years inconclusively, because by then I had started writing songs and that's all I really wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a BAM magazine started. I wrote for an underground paper in San Jose called the San Jose Red Eye back in the day. I was interested in getting records and concert tickets and stuff, which is so, you know, I was going to trade my writing for access to stuff.
Mm-hmm.
BAM magazine started in 1976 with a very interesting model. They were a free biweekly music magazine that was advertiser supported. It was a very successful model for many years, and they also replicated it with a magazine called Micro Times that was for, and again, this started in the late 70s, early 80s, or maybe Micro Times started after 80. I don't remember exactly, but it was when the personal computer revolution was really taking hold, and there were a lot of people wanting to learn about computers and stuff. So Dennis Erikin was the publisher and founder of both of those magazines, and I sort of cut my teeth on as a journalist at BAM. These were the days. I mean, being a journalist, music journalist, has never paid very well, but these were the days when record companies would fly a guy like me to Detroit to do an interview with Joe Walsh, and they'd fly me to Miami to do an interview with Rod Stewart and things like that. So I really had a great adventure as a music journalist back in those days, and I got to meet a million people. I interviewed Les Paul. I interviewed Ted Templeman, who was the producer of Van Halen and the Doobie Brothers and everybody. And I interviewed Leo Fender a couple times. And so I got the $1 million education that I was hoping for. And I was good enough at it that I got hired by other magazines. I was listed as a contributing editor on a fanzine called Hit Parader for many years in the 80s as well. Rolling Stone started in 67.
Okay.
And by the early 80s had kind of morphed into a cultural magazine doing a lot of other non-music stuff. And they kind of started a music magazine to fill in the gap that they had left behind by the growth of Rolling Stone, and that was Record Magazine. And a
Okay.
colleague of mine gave me the phone number of the editor and said, call this guy and see if they have any use for you. And I joined the staff at the very first issue as their musical instruments correspondent. I was a guy that could, try out a new home recording rig or a pedal and, write something knowledgeable about it. So I started as their musical instruments columnist, but very quickly got snapped up. The editor, David McGee, sort of recognized that I had some talent and began to nurture it. And he is really my favorite teacher I ever had. He was a real mentor to me. He would call me up and we'd go through my articles and he would help me rewrite them and teach me how to structure these things. So I was on the masthead of that magazine from the first issue to the last. In fact, I outlasted the editor by one issue. So and I also worked for an industry magazine called Mix, which started as a recording industry publication as an offshoot of BAM and then became a freestanding magazine of its own. And they hired me to be their music editor. So from 76 to 86, I was a music journalist doing all this mainstream stuff. I interviewed Fleetwood Mac, and I would do industry pieces and tech pieces from here and there too. But I was always most interested in the Grateful Dead, and through my connections, my positions at these magazines, I got to interview Bob Weir in 77, interviewed Robert Hunter in November of 77 when he was just beginning to have more of a public presence. Got to interview Jerry Garcia with my colleague and editor Blair Jackson twice in 81, and so I was off and running. Those things led to my getting into the radio business. In 82, I went to Jamaica for the Thanksgiving weekend of 82. I went to Jamaica for the Jamaica World Music Festival as a music journalist. The Grateful Dead were performing, Bobby and the Midnights were performing, but so was everybody else.
The Clash.
The Clash and Gladys Knight and the Pips and Jimmy Cliff and the Beach Boys. It was an amazing weekend. And Joe Jackson, I interviewed Joe Jackson in Arizona a couple weeks before this festival. So he was kind of surprised to run into me down there in Jamaica too. But it was really fun. And I met Peter Simon on that trip. Peter was very well known photographer and author of a really interesting book on reggae called Reggae Bloodlines. And Peter was there pursuing a book about the Grateful Dead. And I met him at the hotel where they put up all of us press people. And I schmoozed him up and I said, I've got photos that might be of use to you. And what I did not know at the time was that they met with Phil Lesh down there, and Phil suggested that they hire me to write the text for Peter's book, which offer came to me a few months later in the spring of 83. And of course I said yes. And the next thing I know, I'm writing a book called Playing in the Band, an oral and visual portrait of the Grateful Dead. The publication of that book in April of 85 led to my joining the team putting on the K-Fog Deadhead Hour.
Okay.
K-Fog had started doing a Grateful Dead radio show in the fall of 84. Because even before Touch of Grey and their big hit record, the Grateful Dead were already a significant enough cultural phenomenon to merit a regular column in BAM magazine and to merit coverage by national publications and stuff. So I showed up as a guest on the KFOG Deadhead Hour in February of '85, and I produced a little documentary about one of the Grateful Dead songs that has a really interesting story, greatest story ever told. And within a few months, the management of the station had asked me to take responsibility for doing the Deadhead Hour because the guy that was doing it was already seriously overworked. He was the morning drive DJ, and he had his own show, the Sunday Night Idiot Show. So he was kind of happy to have it taken off his plate. And I was really happy to take it over, even though it was another thing to do that didn't pay very well. But God damn, it was fun. So I became host of the KFOG Deadhead Hour in sometime in like late '86. And that led to, without my ever intending to, other stations started calling and asking if they could carry it. So I got permission from the Grateful Dead to syndicate that show. And almost 40 years later, I'm still doing that.
How did they approach the Grateful Dead though to say, hey, we want to play your live recordings? I mean, obviously the Grateful Dead are known for sharing their recordings and not, letting people tape, but to actually put it on a radio.
Well, I guess they must have asked permission. At the time that this started in '84, there were one of the DJs on staff at KFOG was Mary Holloway, and she was Mickey Hart's life partner at the time. So she may have made the connection between KFOG and the Grateful Dead to get permission. But when I signed on and started hosting, the Grateful Dead knew me. I had been covering them for several years already, and they gave me permission. And I went to a band meeting. John McIntyre, one of the managers, took me to a band meeting and said, David's doing this radio show on KFOG and other stations want to carry it. What do you think? And they all said, sure, go for it. We trust you. And they let me into the vault. This was before Dick Latvala had been hired as the archivist. And I went to Front Street one day and Willie Legate, fascinating character, basically just opened the door to the vault and said, knock yourself out, and didn't even supervise me. I mean, I could have plundered the place, but I wasn't interested in doing that. I wanted to go in and listen to music. So the Grateful Dead supported my doing that program from the beginning.
Can I just say that as a kid in high school, 87, 88, 89, I would make sure I was home Saturday night at midnight so I could press record on the tape. And I taped every week. And some of the best Grateful Dead recordings I had, obviously, were these parts of shows, Swing in 77, Dane County in 73 and things. But just the education that you imparted to me with the stories and the backgrounds and things like that is fascinating. And I guess you've taken that now and you're doing it at Stanford, right?
That's true, yeah. Well, what you just said is one of the most gratifying things that happens in my life. When I meet people like you, people have come up to me, and said, I'm a Deadhead because of your radio show. And I always say thank you, and I always say I hope your parents have forgiven me. Because that was the idea. I was proselytizing the Grateful Dead, and I was doing it by presenting the music and explaining what was going on in the music, not at great long-winded length, of course, but setting some context for what was going on and promoting the music. And the band understood that. Phil Lesh said, this is an ad for the band. And they trusted me to put their best foot forward musically and to put it in some useful context and stuff. And that has been my mission this whole time. And I'm almost exactly 2 months away from the 40th anniversary of my first radio broadcast. Nice. And I didn't plan any of it.
That's amazing. And okay, so as I'm sitting here listening to you, your experience with different kinds of media. So you have so much print media experience, and then of course the radio. I'm an education researcher now. I was a teacher for a long time, but before all of that, my life goals were to be in radio, and I got to do some of that when I was in my early 20s and fell in love with radio itself, just as a form of communication. I was curious, from your perspective, do you have a preferred media that you kind of really enjoy being a part of, or do you see benefits to all of that? And then I guess the second part of that question is, where does that all fit in today? You know, is there still a place for all of this, or has that changed?
Well, everything that I do for a living has gotten less lucrative over time.
Mhm.
You still go out and you play your guitar and sing and come home with $50, exactly like you did 40 years ago. If you're lucky. I mean, some gigs pay better and stuff, but nobody buys CDs anymore. But I still have made CDs and used Kickstarter and stuff like that, and all but one of my CDs have been profitable. They've at least paid for themselves and broken even. I've published 6 books, I think, and all of them have been well received, and a couple of them are still in print. And I sell them myself. And one of my pandemic things was to finally get off my lazy ass and open an online store, which has been great because I sell signed books through my online store, and I sell music and t-shirts and mugs and stuff too. All of those, I mean, radio. I also work for satellite radio now. When the Sirius Grateful Dead channel was started, they hired me to consult on the construction of the programming and stuff, which was, of course, a no-brainer. Live concerts 3 times a day, a historical feature, and then a huge library of live and studio recordings. And I mean, it was easy. And we started it in the fall of 2007. And they suggested we launch a talk show in January 2008, which we did. That's Tales from the Golden Road. It's been super successful. We've never run out of phone calls, so that's been fun. So radio, and I'm somewhat surprised that my radio show is still viable. But terrestrial radio, which is a retronym because satellite radio caused the creation of the word terrestrial radio by contrast, is still there, and it's a struggling business like so many modern media are. But my radio show still has an audience, and people still support it at fundraising time and stuff. And in fact, that's one of the things I want to mention is that I'm doing a marathon, Grateful Dead fundraising marathon, for a small station in Kauai called KKCR, Kauai Community Radio, and it's going to happen starting in the evening of Friday, January 17th, and go for 24 hours. And it's going to be streamed on nugs and gdradio.net. So all of us on the mainland can watch it too. So the short answer to your question is it's hard to make a living doing all these things, but I somehow managed to cobble a living together from all of them. And I get to keep doing these things I want to do. I just announced I had the tremendous privilege of doing the text for a book of Jim Marshall's Grateful Dead photos, a legendary photographer. And if you don't know his name, you know his work. You've seen a bunch of his photos because they're truly, justly legendary. And Jim was a great friend of the Grateful Dead in the first 10 years of their existence. And I was asked to do the text for a book that's Grateful Dead by Jim Marshall, that's coming out in August of next year. And I got to interview tons of musicians who were his peers. I spent an amazing afternoon with Mountain Girl going over all the photos and just collecting stories from her. And I talked to Herbie Green, who was a contemporary of Jim's. So I'm still doing books, and I'm going to do a book after that. A photographer named Bill Lemke reached out to me. He took photos of deadheads, beautiful studio shots of deadheads in the late 80s, and then recently went back and found a bunch of those people and took photos of them again. So we're going to do a book of then and now collection. We have like 25 or 30 pairs of these images that were taken like in 1989 and again in 2009, that kind of thing. And they're just beautiful. They're stunning. And I get to go talk to these people and get stories and write the text to go between the then and now photos and stuff. And after that, I want to do another book. I published Conversations with the Dead in 1991, a compilation of transcripts of my interviews. And I've never stopped interviewing people in that world. So I'm getting ready to propose Conversations with the Dead volumes 2 and 3 for the next couple of years.
Because that's like 30 years, right? Worth of stuff. More than 30 years.
I've been doing all these interviews, and I've talked to tons more people. So I have the tremendous privilege of getting to do work that I love about music that I love while pursuing my own musical life. If I had put all my eggs in the basket of trying to be a singer-songwriter back in the day, my career already would have flamed out and I'd be working in a gas station or something now.
Yeah.
So I did all these other things while continuing to make my own music. So I don't depend on my own musical life, but it's an adjunct to everything else that I'm doing, and everything they synergize together. Everything that I'm doing, it all feeds the same thing, and I get to do this music work, and I can afford to do these books, even though it can't be the only thing that I do because I got to pay my mortgage. But all of the things that I do add up to my being able to keep doing them, and that's
Yes.
kind of all I care about. I'm married to a retired school teacher who had a really, really, really good health plan. So that's a key thing. And I own a house because I inherited $40,000 in the early 90s from the only wealthy person in my family tree. And it was just enough to make a down payment on a house. So my wife and I just kind of squeezed into a middle class life by virtue of that one inheritance and her career as a teacher paying for a good
Mhm.
health plan. So we are healthy geezers in a house that we own, despite the fact that we're both artists and probably should have just been penniless for most of our lives.
I think so. The patchwork quilt of all of these experiences is amazing. That's just the visual that I get when you're talking is, these layers, and it does fit, and there's these different moments that come about. And I would imagine that you are able to reference so much of this for your Stanford continuing study courses. And I really would love to talk about that because on a personal level, bringing worlds together, academia, music, that kind of cultural, lens to things, to me is absolutely magical. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that started, and then I've got some curiosities too about some of the topics that you cover there.
I'm delighted to tell you about it because it's another one of the stories of my life of like just amazing miracles.
There she is.
It's going away, going out for the afternoon. That's Rita.
Hi, Rita.
Have fun, honey. Um, I've often, they say that luck is the residue of hard work, and I have definitely worked very hard, but I've also just been incredibly lucky. The chance encounters that have led to cool things and doors that have opened in front of me, and I'll claim credit for being smart enough to walk through the door, but the Stanford thing happened because a colleague of mine, Joel Selvin, who was the San Francisco Chronicle's music critic for about 40 years, called me one day about a little over a year ago and told me that Stanford Continuing Studies was looking for somebody to teach a class about the Grateful Dead, and he thought I might be a good candidate for it. He gave me a phone number to call or an email address, and I contacted this gentleman down there at Stanford. And I told him who I am and showed him my resume or whatever. And he said, "Oh, this will probably be fine. Let's do it." And they allowed me to create a class. They gave it a name, Psychedelia and Groove, something, something Grateful Dead, which wasn't my choice of name. But they allowed me to do it as a sort of a seminar rather than a structured pedagogical exercise. Because I knew, first of all, that most of the people in the class were already fans and would know the history. So I said, I don't want to do a lecture series. Let's stipulate to the history and put a couple of histories in the syllabus so people can,
Mhm.
catch up if they want to. But my specialty is I know how this music works. And I have stories and I've talked to these musicians and I know how, I know what they have to say. And so I want to do this as a more practical and story driven class to focus on the music and how the music works. Again, you can stipulate to the history, you can catch up on the history and all that stuff. And I put a bunch of things in the syllabus. There's a wonderful film called Box of Rain by Lonnie Frazier that I put in the syllabus because it's her personal story of how she had a traumatized experience when she was a kid and was healed by going on an adventure to see the Grateful Dead. And it's just a lovely documentary that tells one person's story that can be sort of universalized.
Mm-hmm.
other people have had the similar kind of experience of being welcomed into this culture and finding the music really compelling. I came into it from the music, but there are a lot of other ways to come into this. And she came into it needing, some social support and stuff. And a friend brought her to it, and it became a life for her. So I put that in the syllabus. And I really just wanted to tell stories and share this music and what's magical about the music. And they let me bring lots of guest lecturers in. I had Jesse, not lecturers, that's the wrong word, guest speakers, because I really just brought them in and we talked about music. Jesse Jarnow, who's an author of amazing books like Heads and Wasn't That a Time, and is also the producer and host of the Good Old Grateful Dead cast, which is the best book about the Grateful Dead. Not a book, it's a podcast, but it's an amazingly deep history. Gary Lambert, my co-host on Tales from the Golden Road, with whom I've played music off and on for 40 years, brought him in because he knows these guys and he's worked for the Grateful Dead for 30 years. And we've spent a lot of time. We both between us have interviewed Grateful Dead members hundreds of times, And I brought Peter Richardson in, who wrote a terrific history called No Simple Highway: A Social History of the Grateful, or Cultural History of the Grateful Dead. And so it was very loose, very unstructured, and had music listening in the middle of the class. And we would do, Gary and I in particular, we did separate listening sessions too, where you can't really listen to a 45-minute Grateful Dead jam in a 2-hour class. You're going to run out of time, right? So what we did was we kind of edit out the body of the song and just do the interesting part between songs. So I would fade it in. For example, there's an amazing second set jam at Portland, Oregon, 5/19/74, a show that I was at. I wanted to play that because it had this big long stretch of amazing stuff in it. So I faded it in at the end of Truckin', and we just listened to the jams in between. And then when it got to another song, I faded it out again. So I say, I'm just bringing sort of the knees and the elbows of these jams rather than the entire body of it, because you just want to get to the interesting part. And then we would listen to the music and talk about what's going on. Like, listen to Phil, he's stepping out and driving the train right here, and then listen to Jerry's doing this thing. And you can listen to how the band managed these transitions when they were really listening to each other.
Mm-hmm.
I also have experiences that I played. I did an interview when the 100-Year Hall album came out. Marty Martinez and I interviewed Phil and Bobby together to talk about the Europe 72 tour. And there's an amazing stretch of music in 100-Year Hall coming out of Turn On Your Love Light. When the band starts playing, they start playing like a really fast going down the road feeling bad, and they go, not yet, not yet. And then somebody starts playing Not Fade Away, and they're sort of playing both songs at the same time. And then they sort of wander off into this other completely unexpected jam, and then move back in the direction of, so they're playing like three things at once for about 3.5 minutes. And I got to talk to those guys about it. I got this beautiful quote from Phil. It's like, oh man, that is the stuff we live for. So I played that for the class. I played the interview segment where they talk about it, and then I played the stretch of music itself, So again, this is where all my experiences and my library of interviews pays off, because I can excerpt. I also had Phil and Jerry together once up at Phil's house talking about their experiences in making music together. So I could pull little 1 and 2 minute things out of those interviews and play those for the class too. And sure enough, when I went to start teaching the class, first of all, they expected like 50, 60 people in this class, and we had 330 for the first version. The second edition of the class, they allowed me to refine it a little more, and they allowed me to use the name that I wanted. The second version of the class that just ended was called Did It Matter, Does It Now? The Music and Culture of the Grateful Dead. And that had 255 students in it, some of whom were repeaters. People came back for the second version of the class because they knew it would be different. Some of the same speakers and a little bit of the same music, but they knew that it would be different. because it was never structured and planned out. It was improvisational. The third edition of the class, which happens next spring, is going to be more musical listening in the class and less talk. And that one's going to be called Composition, Improvisation, and Interpretation, the Music of the Grateful Dead. And I'll have some of those guest speakers again, but I'm going to have musicians joining me. Rob Baracco and Jeff Mattson of Dark Star Orchestra, both of whom I've known for 30 years, each are going to take a turn being a guest speaker in that class, and we'll co-curate the playlists, and I'll have those guys picking their favorite passages of music talking about.
Nice.
So that's the thing that I have been to. I know musicologists. I've been to these scholarly conferences, and I know really, really brilliant musicologists. Sean O'Donnell is one of the guys who talks on the Good Old Grateful Dead cast. He's a musician and a musicologist, and he can talk about the musicological structures and stuff. I can't, and I don't. That's not the interesting part to me. I can tell you what it's like to play that music, to hold a guitar in your hands and play that music and listen to the other people and respond to the other people. And I've had conversations with every band member just about what that's like and how to do it. And that's what I bring to these classes is the practical knowledge and specific examples from both my interview library and the Grateful Dead's vault of how this music works. And that's what I bring to it. And I had thought for years, and I'd had some of my academic friends tell me that I should teach, but I had never formed any kind of notion of how to pursue that. Like, what would I do? I'd have to design a class, then I'd have to go pitch it to campuses and stuff. And it's something I thought, yeah, I'd love to do that sometime, but I had never formed the notion of how to do it. And it dropped in my lap. Joel called me, said, call those people. I got this gig doing it. It turned out to be a really fun thing that I am suited to do. And so once again, a miraculous gift has landed in my lap of an opportunity to do something, and I have managed to deliver it. So again, luck is the residue of hard work, and I have done the work, but I've also just been insanely lucky.
Well, you know, there's so many different ways we could go with this. I have some curiosities about your experiences with facilitating these conversations in the courses. The first thing, as I was thinking about this and have thought about the listening experience that you take the attendees and participants through, we know that memory is often unreliable. You know, our perception of situations is very individualized. I'm curious if people come to different understandings or perceptions of what you would have them listen to. So same passage, same jam. Do people hear different things there? And what kind of conversations would you have around that?
It's interesting. I don't. There's a certain amount of interaction with the class, but usually it's been mostly one direction. Me and the speakers going out, but occasionally we'll stop and ask for comments and questions. But the chat, all the class, by the way, takes place on Zoom. I teach it from home. So, and there's students are everywhere, all over the planet, you know. So it's not people in a room listening, it's on Zoom. And the chat is full of people commenting on things, going back and forth. So a lot of times, sometimes I'll play a piece of music. Or another one of the things that I like to do in the class is play other people's performances of Grateful Dead songs. Because there's like so many. Don was, there's a saxophonist in Detroit named Dave McMurray who's done 2 full albums of his jazz interpretations of Grateful Dead songs. Wonderful records. There's a band out here called Wake the Dead that does Celtic interpretations of Grateful Dead songs. Michaela Davis plays Grateful Dead music on a harp in upstate New York. And I have a friend in Oregon who also plays the harp and plays Grateful Dead music. And we've played in a band together a few times. And there's all these other people's great versions of Grateful Dead songs. And sometimes I'll play one of them for the class and let them see if they can figure out who it is. Like
you did on the Deadhead Hour. You would do that. On the Deadhead Hour, you would do that. You play like Cumberland Blues, somebody covering Cumberland Blues, or the Seldom Seen doing I Know You Rider or something.
Yeah. Well, that to me, that was, and that's fascinating because every once in a while, in the early days of the Grateful Dead channel on Sirius XM, we would play some of those covers, and once in a while somebody would just complain just violently. We don't want to hear somebody else's version of that. Spare me that shit. I just want to hear Jerry. That's not my attitude. I always wanted to hear everybody. I wanted to hear the Grateful Dead's take on other people's music, and I wanted to hear other people's take on Grateful Dead music. I am an interpreter of Grateful Dead music. I play Grateful Dead songs myself, and I change the key, and I change the groove, and I change, the because that's what this is about. What I learned from Jerry was to tell the story in your own voice.
Mhm.
I'm not interested in copying them. It's
Mhm.
great that there are copycat bands out there that are really, really good at it, because
Mhm.
people crave that experience. You go to the Dark Star Orchestra because you want to hear that Jerry tone, you want to
Mm.
hear the B3, you want to hear, you want to hear them replicate a Grateful Dead concert. But I also want to go hear that guy playing it a completely different way, on his dulcimer or whatever, and
Mhm.
and hear how the song sounds when it's filtered through somebody else. So I want to explore every corner of that world. And yeah, that's been my mission since the beginning. I'll play other people's takes on these things. I've got to put together an album called Stolen Roses: Songs of the Grateful Dead, which was other people's covers of Grateful Dead songs. Some of which, like the day Jerry died, Patti Smith was in the studio and she recorded this weird little version of Black Peter, which I had
Mhm.
heard about through mutual friends. And I got her permission to use that on the album. I
Nice.
had that version of Cumberland Blues from the Cats Valley Drifters that you
Right.
mentioned earlier.
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
got to put that on the record. I got the Stanford Marching Band's version of Uncle John's Band from an album they put out years and years ago. And I also got to commission a few things. I asked David Grisman to play Dark Star, and he did a really interesting David Grisman quintet version of Dark Star for that record. But it's been, and I also got to produce a record of the Grateful Dead doing Bob Dylan songs called Postcards of the Hanging. Grateful Dead
Mhm.
performing songs of Bob Dylan. So I have fostered and curated interpretation albums of interpretations in both directions: the Grateful Dead interpreting others, and others interpreting the Grateful. So yeah, I've been doing all these things that serve this music, and I have spent my entire adult life inhabiting that music and bringing that music into my own world and illuminating it for others. It's been a wonderful.
Mhm.
And at Stanford, it's just another continuation of that allows me to do it in a setting that just takes maximum advantage of my archive. I'm again eternally grateful that I've had this opportunity to continue furthering that mission.
So why ask the questions? Did it matter? Does it now? When I saw the expanded, I think that was last year, the news of the expanded course and the change in the title, which I think you mentioned was maybe what you had originally thought.
Yeah.
Those are very interesting questions, and I'm just curious what makes that the focus for you, that it would be the title of the
It's a
course?
phrase from a song, of course. It's
Mhm.
from a song called St.
Sure.
one of the earliest and most important original compositions of the Grateful Dead. And to me, I wanted, as soon as I got the offer to do the class, they had already locked in a different name for the class, but they were flexible and allowed me to. And by the way, we changed the name and the catalog number of the class so that people could take it again for credit.
Mhm.
Oh, okay.
So a lot of the students want the one unit of credit for whatever reason. So that's why we changed the name and the number of the class. The next one's going to be Music 72, and et cetera. But I just thought that phrase really kind of sets it up. This was important music in its moment, and it's still important music now. And the Grateful Dead is more popular now than it was when Jerry died. Just in terms of economic power, the Grateful Dead as an economic engine is gigantic, and there's people playing this music all over the country. And Grateful Dead music is a musical idiom unto itself, and so it's deserving of the attention that we're giving it. And it continues to be relevant because the songs are so great, and people still want to play them, and people want to continue to improvise in the structures created by the Grateful Dead. And so, did it matter? Does it now? The answer is yes and yes. That's why I chose that title, so that I can answer it yes and yes.
I love it. That's great.
I always feel so what Joseph Campbell, his whole idea of myth and community and all that is why the Grateful Dead is what it is. And famously, I guess he saw him and he saw that in what it was. But I think that's part of what drives it is we desire as human beings what the Grateful Dead offer as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Campbell saw that, and he recognized that shared ecstatic experience is a human tradition that goes back thousands of years, and this was just a new and sort of high-tech version of that. He recognized that. And by the way, I got to go to a dinner party at Weir's house one time, and I got to watch Phil Lesh and Jerry Garcia sitting at Joe Campbell's feet like we would sit at theirs, being total fanboys. Phil brought his copy of The Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake for Campbell to autograph. And it was really, really fun watching those guys, being fans of somebody else.
Just suck in all that knowledge.
Yeah, it was an amazing experience. But the Grateful Dead, and I didn't figure this out until some years into it. I didn't really realize that oh, you have a dog behind you.
I know he's been hiding. Hold on.
It just appeared. Hi there. I saw the tail, the white end of the tail start to move.
Yes, he's actually that's his perch. He looks out at me all day when I'm on Zoom for work from that chair.
What's his name?
His name's Yawkey. He's a Bernedoodle, big fluffy Muppet.
Yeah. What were we talking about?
He has a tendency to do that to people.
Joseph Campbell and me.
Oh yeah, I started going to Grateful Dead shows for the music, and I went for the music, and I didn't even realize that all this stuff was going on until like 1986, when my friends and I started an online Grateful Dead community at the Well, which is still exists, by the way. And I went out in when the Dead played the Berkeley Community Theater in April of '86. We went out to Leaflet before the show. And there was this whole scene set up in the park across the street where people were selling stuff. And I had never really noticed that before because I just went to the shows and came home. And I suddenly realized that there was this culture that had sprung up around the Grateful Dead and it had been there for years. I just hadn't really noticed it till then. But when we started this online community, it picked up steam immediately because it turns out people want to talk about this. It's a fascinating subject. There's a lot to talk about. Deadheads want to talk about the music. They want to talk about trading tapes. They want to talk about scoring tickets. They want to talk about, what hotel is everybody going to be staying at outside of, in Chicago, that kind of thing. We started topics to talk about the song lyrics. We started topics to talk about tape trading and traveling and drugs and everything else. So it just turns out to be, I mean, look how many people, when you go online, I just started, posting and reading on Blue Sky in the last couple of months, a really nice new community that's starting up as an answer to some ugly shit over that other place. And there's so many people whose identities in social media are defined by the Grateful Dead. There's a Steely in their profile picture, or their name is, Bobby Dead 77 and things like that. I mean, the Grateful Dead is so integrated into people's online identities, and you see them wearing their tie-dyes out in the you know what I mean? It's like it's a cultural identity that is very, very powerful to a lot of people. For better and for worse. I mean, there's a lot of exploitation and parasitic stuff that happens in that world as well, as there is in any kind of culture that has any kind of economic presence to it. But for the most part, it's an incredibly positive thing. And it's a lovely situation where you can meet somebody new and immediately have deep, deep stuff to talk about. And you can start comparing notes and realize that you've been occupying this cube of time and space that goes back 60 years, and you can figure out that you and I were in the same place. Oh yeah, where were you sitting at that show? Yeah, I remember that one. God, that was great. So you immediately have this huge stream of shared experience that you can compare notes with people about, and so it's. Steve Silverman said that to me. I interviewed him in the early '90s about all this stuff, and he said I didn't really set out to become a deadhead. I just went to a show, and I went to another show, and then I went to another show, and the next thing I know, I've been going to shows for 17 years, and everybody I know is a deadhead. It's just people, I now know deadhead families that are 4 generations deep.
No.
It's an amazing thing.
Yeah, my kids are okay with the dead. They're not okay with fish. They're like, Dad, what is up with that?
Very different. This is an unfair question, so I'm just going to say that up front. I mean, do you think it's possible in the world that we have today that something like that could happen again? That what you're describing, right? That sense of familiarity, all of those components that together create this ecosystem, right? This living, breathing thing.
Continues to happen in the jam band world. I mean, I have completely fallen out of touch with most of that stuff because my day job has been curating Grateful Dead music, and I've been managing my own musical creativity for 50 years. I never got a chance to get up to speed on Fish. I've heard some Fish and I enjoy Fish on a certain level, but I'm not literate in that music.
Right.
And all the other bands from the next generation after Grateful Dead, Moe and Widespread Panic and
God Street Wine.
and yeah, there's just huge numbers of bands, and a lot of them modeled their marketing and their social thing on the Grateful Dead, and they recognized that allowing people to tape and creating an online community was part of the thing. And that's now 2 or 3 or 4 generations of bands down the line. Now everybody's following Goose around the country.
Right.
And I mean, there are bands that are consciously and deliberately emulating the structure that the Grateful Dead came to organically.
Why reinvent the wheel?
Well, if it works for them,
right?
But it also, you have to have the compelling content. I didn't become a deadhead just to follow a bunch of people in tie-dye. I became a deadhead because this music wouldn't let go of me.
And it wasn't Johnny Be Good, it was Dark Star or Eyes of the World that was what pulled you in.
Kevin, that's a really important point because the Grateful Dead were so eclectic that they could attract people from all those different cultures. You could come in because you like the way they do Johnny Cash. You could come in because you like the way they do Chuck Berry. You can come in because you like the 30 minutes of no particular song. And, so they appeal to bluegrass fans, they appeal to jazz fans, they appeal to improvisation fans. And so Grateful Dead shares musical territory with all these other forms, which is another one of the ways that they made themselves attractive and broadly attractive, because it wasn't a niche thing. It was attractive and accessible to lots of different kinds of people. And that's a really important point that you just made. And it I think that a lot of the sort of stigma of being a deadhead came up in the 70s when so much of, like punk and new wave was such a reaction against what they considered stodgy, reptilian 70s progressive rock and
Clapton.
Stuff like that. Behemoth, yacht rock, right?
Another Clapton album, right?
Right. But it turns out the Grateful Dead were punks all along. The Grateful Dead were sort of the ultimate DIY band. And it turned out, by the way, along the way, that a lot of punks were deadheads. In 1988, Henry Kaiser called me. I had heard of Henry, but I didn't know him. He invited me to perform, to record with him. He was making a record with a couple of Dead songs, and he wanted me to sing and play lead on Mason's Children on this record.
Those who know history are doomed to repeat it, is the
yeah. And I was just I was blown away that a guy like Henry wanted me to play on his record and stuff. But now I forgot where I was going with this.
Oh, the punk, like Black Flag.
Right.
Black Flag, great kid.
He
Yeah.
recorded, right. Greg Ginn and Henry Rollins were big Deadheads, and they signed Henry to SST Records to do a Grateful Dead album. That's a weird ass thing. But and then all these other, like now, I mean, I think that was sort of the beginning of the destigmatization of it as the generation that was an immediate reaction to the hippies. And also that's another thing. A lot of people, if you ask them what they hate about the Grateful Dead, it turns out they don't like hippies.
Mhm.
They didn't know anything. I would always say to these people, you hate the Grateful Dead? You have to hate a lot of music to not find something to like in the Grateful.
It was a reaction to the culture, I think.
Yes, they don't like the hippies. People, well, first of all, it is kind of annoying when you meet people that don't give a shit about anything but that one thing.
Right.
The single-mindedness of Deadheads can be off-putting to some people. Plus the relentless pleasantness of it. Jesus, they're all smiling at each other and sharing joints and stuff. And, punk was a lot of safety pin through the nose kind of music and stuff.
Well,
So
but I mean, if you go back to like the earliest, the foundations of punk, like the MC5, MC5 and the Grateful Dead were not that far apart with the blues idiom based jams. It was just the lyrical content and the attitude of it.
yes. Well, and that was another thing too. My contemporaries, like Dave Marsh, one of the premier music journalists when I was coming up, Dave just hated the Grateful Dead. But if you realize that after talking with him for a while, and he and Lee Ballinger published this newsletter called Rock and Roll Confidential that was a really, really great alternative sort of economic, socio-political critique of the music business. And I figured out that Dave Marsh hated the Grateful Dead because they were hedonists. They weren't revolutionaries, and they failed the test of, kicking out the jams. So, and, Carol Brightman wrote a wonderful book called Sweet Chaos, The Grateful Dead's American Adventure. Carol was the sister of Candace Brightman, the Grateful Dead's lighting director, but she was a Venceremos. She was a total committed leftist activist. She went to Cuba with the Venceremos Brigade and stuff like that. She was like, a campus revolutionary in the 60s. And her book was an examination of why the hedonistic culture of the Grateful Dead continued to thrive while so many of the important social movements of the 60s dried up and withered. And the Grateful Dead were offering joy and pleasure in this world, and also a critique of capitalism in their own way. I once there's a guy whose name is eluding me at the moment, published a book called Grateful Dead and Philosophy as a series of philosophy books with different things. I can't remember his name, but he gave a presentation at one of these conferences about the parking lot scene at Grateful Dead shows. Was it a critique of capitalism or an instance of capitalism?
Right.
And the answer was it was both, of course, because the Grateful Dead were critiquing their culture. They were just doing it in an indirect and hedonistic way rather than a direct and challenging way.
Right. Makes
Well,
sense.
and that makes me wonder too, because this comes up sometimes in our conversations, whether or not bands or artists have a social responsibility to be active in whichever causes are important to them, with the reach that they have and the ability to,
Should they
more
endorse the
publicly talk
president?
about,
Should they endorse the presidential
like,
candidate or not?
yeah,
I
or
would-
whatever causes. I mean, is that incumbent on them? Yeah.
I don't know that it's an obligation. I don't think we can insist that anybody else is obligated to do any particular thing. But I came up listening to Pete Seeger, listening to Jackson Brown, and listening to people who did want to change the world and who thought music could change the world. And I've embraced that kind of music. At the same time, there's all this other kind of music that doesn't give a rat's ass about that stuff. Keller Williams gave an interview in Acoustic Guitar Magazine probably 15 years ago now. And he said something like, well, when I'm at a show, I don't want to hear about people's problems, he said. So I don't write about my problems in my songs. And I I found that remarkable. And I don't begrudge him his choice. But by contrast, I had a conversation with Jerry Garcia once in which we agreed that you can't really appreciate the light without recognizing the darkness.
Mhm.
And the Grateful Dead music did not hesitate to go deep and dark so that, I mean, just think about Death Don't Have No Mercy, followed immediately by a rousing love light. The Grateful Dead took you all the way into hell for a visit and then took you all the way into heaven
Mhm.
to wrap it up. And my own songs, I have lots of songs that are protest songs or socially critical songs and stuff, and I don't hesitate to play them because it is important. And I do feel like I once, Jeb Perrier of Dawn of the Buffalo. I love Dawn of the Buffalo. Fabulous band out of upstate New York. Great grooves, wonderful songwriting. Their tribe of fans is delightful. I love them. I haven't seen them in a few years. We used to play the same festivals a bunch. I asked Jeb, so many of their songs were spiritually positive and seemed almost. I asked him if he was espousing a particular religion because I noted so much of his music seemed pointed in the direction of um, leadership, spiritual leadership of some kind. He said, no, no, not really. I'm not into a particular religion. He said, but I grew up listening to Bob Marley and the Beatles. And I just think if you're going to get people's attention, you should do something useful with it. Well, I've never regarded music as purely an escape. I've regarded music as a medium for communication. And I tell a lot of unpleasant stories in my songs, not to piss people off, but because they need to be heard. And I one of my songs that I play a lot is a song I wrote called "It's Going to Get Worse Before It Gets Better," but I know it's going to get better. You got to talk about the stuff that's going on, but you got to throw an optimistic message at the end of it. I have another song called "Save Us from the Saved," which I wrote 20 some years ago, which is a complaint about Christo-fascists. And I kept thinking that maybe that one would go out of style, but the Christo-fascists
It's
keep
hot now, hotter than ever.
exactly. And so we need to be saved from the saved now more than ever. I have lots of songs that are just goofy and fun too.
You do a live stream every day?
Yeah, since the pandemic started. I've missed a bunch of days for this and that, but when April 2020 was going to be my biggest month ever as a musician. I had 2 festivals and a 2-week tour. In fact, was in conflict with my wife over how much time I would be away that month. And the pandemic hit in March, and one by one, those gigs just dried up. So on April 3rd, and then I started looking and see who's doing what. Fish was going to do a live stream event, and Bobby Weir was doing a live stream event, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, well, if I wait until nobody's playing, I'll never do anything. So I said, I'm just going to play every day. And you could do it. You can go onto Facebook and start streaming every freaking day. So starting on April 3rd, 2020, I did it. I've missed a bunch of shows. I've done a few tours here and there and took a vacation here and there. But I have played more than 1,000, probably closer
Pretty
to
consistent. You're pretty consistent with it.
yeah. And it was just I needed to do it to keep my fingers in my throat working. I needed to do it to maintain contact with an audience, and I needed to do it to try to make a few bucks after those gigs dried up. And it turned out to be a very popular thing. I picked up a crowd of regulars, and there are a couple dozen people still today that watch every day. And I've gotten to be friends with quite a few of them, and a bunch of them still, kick in a few bucks to the tip jar. And I do it again today, 4 o'clock California time. I'll do it almost every
Couple
day.
hours from now.
Yeah, and I do it on YouTube. I have a channel on YouTube, and I have my D Gans music channel on Facebook. I used to do it on Twitter every day too, but they changed the rules there, so you have to pay for a blue check, and I refuse to do that. In fact, I quit Twitter altogether. Now I almost simulcast on Blue Sky. As soon as I start the stream, I post the link on Blue Sky so people can watch it there. It's not possible to live stream on Blue Sky yet. But as soon
The key to doing that, Dave, is you got to have a YouTube channel. I post the YouTube link, and people can watch this.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, that's
So
exactly what I do. But soon
right.
soon they'll set it up so you can just live stream directly
Right.
onto.
There you go. Right, directly onto there. Yeah,
It's
I hear
really
you with that.
fun.
So you
I
look
play
good
every day.
you look good in blue. I saw some pictures of you playing out the other night.
You mean Bertha?
Yes.
Oh, that was so much fun. That was so great. It's for those who don't know, it's Bertha Grateful Drag. They're based in Nashville. It was started by my dear friends Melody Walker and Jacob Grootman, uh, who came up out here and moved to Nashville about 9 years ago. When the Christo-fascists of Tennessee passed a bunch of laws forbidding like transsexuals from reading stories to kids, for fuck's sake. They decided to start a band to thumb their noses at the Christo-fascists, and so they started playing as Bertha Grateful Drag, and it took off immediately. They played up some gigs in Tennessee that went well, and now they're on tour. They played the Kennedy Center a few days before the big ceremony with the Dead Guys, and they played the UC Theater here in Berkeley last Saturday, a week ago today, and they invited me to join in. A bunch of other people, the T Sisters, Alex Jordan, um, AJ Lee, and Joe Craven and his daughter Hattie played. And so yeah, I got to go do the full thing, man. They dolled me up. They first of all, my friend Lexi Zipkin, when she found out that I was doing this gig, she plays the same kind of guitar as I do, but it has a purple paint job on it. So she texted me and said, "Do you want to play like a really gay guitar at the thing?" And I said, "Oh, hell yes, I do." So I took a photo of that guitar, and I went over to rehearse with the Bertha people, and then we went out shopping for me. We went to a thrift store in Albany, California, and bought a dress that would match the guitar I was borrowing from Lexi. Then we bought a purple wig to go with it. And on Saturday, everybody showed up at the venue for sound check, and then we spent 3 hours doing makeup. And it was literally a really, really big job. Melody came at me with a glue stick, and they plaster your eyebrows down and build up this huge layer of waxy crap so they can paint new eyebrows on up above the ones that are there, right? And then they painted huge red lips on my face, and it took 3 or 4 different artists, by the way. Melody started. Sunshine Becker just came. She's a great musician from the Bay Area, and she just came to help with makeup, not even to be in the show. She just came to help with my face and other people's faces. So we spent the afternoon getting all done up, and then we did this amazing show, and they're all just tremendous musicians. All the guests were great. I got to sing and play guitar on West LA Fadeaway, a really gnarly version of West LA Fadeaway with them. And it just went on from there, and everybody was terrific. And I had such a great time doing it. And it turns out I have really well-formed arms. People,
David Gans.
I thought I was a particularly unpleasant-looking old woman, but other people thought I had really good-looking arms. So go figure.
Well, a very good friend of mine, Susan Wyan, who's a photographer, was there.
Down there.
Yeah. I talked to her just a couple of days before the UC Berkeley show, and she was saying, I'm so curious. This is something new, and it's a different take on all of this, and that was really exciting to her. And so I was really anxious to see the photos that she got, which were wonderful. And yeah, I mean, her take on it was just what you said. It was a beautiful way to express the music, but also culturally too, just inherent in what that event is just proclaiming the joy of who we are and what we are. And she really loved it. And I was glad to hear, her reaction to being there, because she's like, I don't really know what this is going to be. I'm curious.
I saw her. I haven't looked at her photos.
Yeah, they're fantastic. But it's that curiosity piece, right, that you kind of have to have, and I think is such a special part of this whole community.
Well, they're really seriously good musicians, all of them. And they decided that if they were going to do drag, they were going to take that seriously too. They didn't want to just they didn't want to make fun of the genre. They wanted to get serious about it. And they got some genuine drag queens to come help with the makeup and stuff too, which was also a fascinating experience. So they weren't going to, just slap on a wig and pretend to be trans. They all are serious. And I watched the band members, and they do this for every show. I did it for one damn song. They do it for every show, and they've all gotten good at doing their makeup and stuff. But they have proper clothes, and they do their makeup really well, and they took the drag as seriously as they take the music. And I think that's really, really worthwhile, because they don't want to be disrespectful to the drag community any more than they want to be disrespectful to the dead community.
They just want to be disrespectful to the fascist community.
Exactly.
Right. Well, I'm looking at the time here. You have been so wonderful and given us so much. David, what are there other things that you have coming up or that you're working on that you would want to share with us, maybe into the new year or anything like that?
Well, I mentioned that I'm working on the Jim Marshall book is coming out next August. There's plenty of time to think about that. The Bill Lemke book is a long ways off because we haven't even started looking for funding for it yet. So that'll be probably in 26. I mentioned also that I'm doing a marathon, a fundraising marathon for KKCR on January 17th and 18th. I'm also doing the annual, I've been doing a KPFA Grateful Dead marathon for more than 30 years. We started doing marathons on KPFA in 1986. And I'll be doing that one again on March 1st. And that will be from like 9 a.m. to midnight California time. And once again, nugs.net and gdradio.net will both be live streaming those. So everybody can listen to these radio fundraisers. And I haven't started really making a lot of plans for 26. I think I'll be at the Sphere for the opening weekend for Sirius XM. They flew us out to be part of the opening weekend last year, so I think we get to go again. And I don't know what else yet. I don't do long tours anymore just because I'm older and a little more ramshackle than I used to be, and also just because I have so much going on that I want to be available. So I don't really do like 2 and 3 week tours anymore. But I do want to go back east again and play. I've started doing some stuff. My niece is a great musician, Caitlin Oliver Gans. She plays in a band called Dark Streets and tours with another band called The Silos also. And she texted me a couple of months ago and said, or like last year now actually, and said a bunch of the musicians that she plays with figured out that she's related to me and were interested in knowing more because, her name is Gans, right? And so she started getting interested in Grateful Dead music because some of her bandmates are interested in Grateful Dead music. And she got us a gig. I played a pickup gig with my niece and 2 of her bandmates in June of last year. And we had so much fun doing it that we did it again in November or October. We played The Bitter End in October of this year. And I want to play with her some more. She's a great musician and is becoming interested in the Grateful Dead. So it's really, really fun to be playing with a family member. And I want to go back and play with her again because the music that we made together was really good. And I just dig playing with her. So I have a feeling I'll be doing some East Coast gigs again in 26. Nice. I don't have any specific plans yet. And I love doing house concerts and things like that too. So I'm open to offers of extraordinary experiences. And I'm going to keep playing every day as long as I don't have something else I need to be doing that day. Just because it's been the greatest thing. My singing and playing have never been better. And I have a devoted audience of regulars. And I also want to mention that I have autographed books and lots of music and stuff available on my online store at perfectible.net.
We'll throw the link in the description on the YouTube channel so people can find that easy.
Kevin, anything that you'd want to ask or add?
No, No, thank you, David, so much. Really, it's such an honor to speak to someone who I listened to when I was in high school. It's crazy. It's crazy to me.
I'm happy to talk with both of you, and I'm happy that my proselytizing about the Grateful Dead has been so effective.
There you go. Right.
Well, and I was going to say, yeah, and I mean, and just thank you for being there to ask the questions so that we could learn and we can, get all of those wonderful stories because you were there to do that. And that's unendingly wonderful, I think, in so many ways. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to do it all these years.
Hold on for a second. I'm going to run an outro so we can thank you off camera. And everybody, remember, like, subscribe, follow us on social media at All That Jam Pod, anywhere you use social media. And remember, stay beautiful, but don't stay underground too long. We'll see you soon. Oh.
Wow.